Welcome back to the Black Line Blueprint, the podcast that breaks through the noise and helps fighters train smart, recover better, and show up strong, both physically and mentally. I'm Coach Frederick, and today we're tackling a problem I see all the time: fighters wasting time on explosive training that doesn't actually build power. You think you're training for knockouts and speed, but the results just aren't there. Let's break down why. As always, I'll be looking at my notes just to stay on track, but let's dive right into it. So, there's a reason your explosive workouts aren't making you more powerful. Strength and power are not the same. You can't train them the same way. So, strength is your ability to produce force, general. So, your ability to produce force regardless of the speed. Power is your ability to produce force quickly. So, you can deadlift a weight off the ground, for instance, very slow, grinding through it. That's your absolute ability to produce force, regardless of the speed. Or you can pull that weight really quickly off the ground instead of grinding through the rep. That would be more of developing power for that movement if it's a speed deadlift, if that makes sense. But if you think about moving a weight quickly, you could think about Olympic lifts, so a power clean. If you think about grinding through reps, like I just said, you could think about deadlifts or a bench press that you see somebody grinding through as well. So here's the thing: if you're weak, you won't be powerful. So you can express certain characteristics, but you won't be powerful. Common problems I typically see is that people want to jump into doing all the power movements. So things that develop power. So box jumps, it could be some med ball throws, it could be Olympic lifts without having a strength base. This doesn't mean that you can't touch on these movements. This doesn't mean that you can't perform the movements and get the technique down with these movements. But what it does mean is you won't express power or be developing power until you actually develop a good, solid strength base. We're talking about a strength base in all of your basic movement patterns that go into the movement that you're trying to develop that power for. So, for instance, if you're trying to do an Olympic lift, if you're trying to do a power clean, you need to be strong enough to hold that weight in position. You need to be strong enough in your hips to, whenever you bend forward, that you're stable in that position. Because from instability, you can't really develop as much force or power as you would if you were stable and strong. And that's one of the key factors into why you need to have a strength base. If you're unstable, then you can't really develop power. The stronger you are, the more stable you can be in certain positions. So if you don't have a good pull, so upper body pulling strength, it's going to be hard for you to keep that weight close to your body when you're going through that movement really quickly, the power clean, for instance. If you're trying to do box jumps, for instance, you're trying to propel your whole entire body weight onto the box. You need to have a good, strong base, your legs, your ankles, your hips. You need to have good, strong legs in order to develop that force quickly to get on top of that box. So let's just say you only have enough force to get on a 12-inch box. Force meaning strength to get on a 12-inch box because you're trying to overcome this weight that you have. If you're a heavier fighter, let's just say you're a heavyweight, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get on that box if you don't have really strong legs to compensate for the weight that you have. You may see lighter fighters getting on a box like relatively easy because they don't need as much strength or as much force to get up onto that box. If you ever seen like anybody trying to develop power in general, you'll know that they're also pretty strong. Most weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters that do the snatch and power clean or the clean and jerk as a sport, you see that they have huge squat numbers. They can pull weight off of the ground very well, and they can hold weight over their head very well also. So they're pretty strong in their lower body, their trunk, their core. They have a really solid base of strength. And that's typically, because I was in that realm for a while, that's typically how we develop those athletes. We do the technique for the power work, we learn the movements, but we know we're not really expressing complete power there or to its fullest potential. But that's the first thing. So not building a strength base. And we'll get into how you can know if you're on the right track as far as building your strength base a little bit later on. So the next common issue is not resting long enough to express power. Here's one of the biggest things that I see because people are trying to get through their training sessions so quickly, they forget that you actually need to rest in order to express power fully. So, for instance, typically the rest period that I've had and stuck to is about 3 minutes between sets of, let's just say, your main power development movement. If we're going to talk about movements that are ballistic in nature, so back squat jumps, trap bar jumps, or any type of weighted movement such as those, you'll want to rest adequately in order to allow your body to replenish its materials to be able to express that thing again. Because when you're fatigued, you're not essentially training power anymore. You're more so just conditioning yourself and developing kind of like endurance and tolerance to the movement. You're not developing full explosive power. So you need to be completely not completely fresh, so to speak, but your system needs to be primed and ready to go. Because let's just say, for instance, you'll know if you're fatigued and you're not developing power anymore, and you're more so just developing some endurance. And some people may call it power endurance, but I don't try to get into all the like little nuances behind that. Just know it's more of an endurance factor. But if let's just say you jump onto a 20-inch box, and on the first set of 3 reps, you get on that box fairly easy, you land pretty tall. But then as the sets go on, you start to not land as high on the box and you land in a deeper squat, and you may have taken shorter rest. And even when you do take a longer rest, you still land on the box kind of like in the lower squat. That should let you know you're pretty much at your limit as far as expression goes, and the fatigue is kind of a little bit too high for you to fully express or develop power. So you want to call that set because now you're just doing junk reps. So you want to make sure that you're resting long enough in between your sets of the movements that you're doing for your power development. So typically I go with 3 minutes. Sometimes you can get away with 2 minutes of rest in between, but 3 minutes is a good rule of thumb, and it will vary from person to person, but you just got to see what works for you. So, and some people may need a little bit longer to rest between those sets. So the next thing is confusing fast movement with power development. So just because you're moving fast doesn't mean that you're, developing power in that frame of reference. So fast movement can literally be me punching out in front of me and bringing it back. That doesn't mean I'm developing power at all, because there might not be enough force behind that movement. So you can see somebody doing a ladder drill and then be like, oh, I'm developing power. But at the same time, if you're not landing on that leg and then pushing off of that leg with trying to reduce the amount of ground contact time, because that's going to allow us to know that you're actually developing that power. You're just kind of moving fast and just pulling your foot off of the ground really quickly. So you can do movements that look quick, but don't actually develop power. Remember, power is force quickly. Your ability to produce force quickly, that's power. So that little tap on the ground isn't really that much force that you have to overcome. But if you're putting your whole entire body weight into that ground contact for that ladder drill, and then you're trying to hop back into place from there, and you're moving fast with that, now you can say you're developing power. But if you're just tapping your foot in and out, you're not developing power. And I'm not trying to, down ladder drills. I'm just trying to say that you have to do them with the right intent behind it and understand what you are trying to develop. If it's more so coordination, then that's another thing. If you're just tapping in and out, that's cool, whatever. But if you're saying you're developing power and you're just tapping your toes in and out of the squares, you're sadly mistaken when it comes to that. So fast movement doesn't actually develop power unless there's some force, a good amount of force behind it that you have to overcome, and then you move quickly behind it. So the next common mistake is copying flashy drills from Instagram with no context or progression. And this can be any social media platform, but it's, so prevalent on Instagram where you see people doing these crazy complex movements. And in general, sometimes they can be unstable surfaces, so you can't develop as much power from that movement as you would because you don't have to overcome so much loading. Um, Mind you, there are a different tiers to developing power as far as what you have to overcome in your sport. But if we're talking about in general, just pure power development, from a standpoint of overcoming a high amount of force. So being able to like launch your opponent with a throw, being able to throw a punch, you have to be able to put a lot of force into the ground and allow that to come up the chain and then go into that punch. And if you can't develop a lot of force, then that punch isn't going to have much power behind it because it's a lower level of force. So it's going to be a lower overall amount of power coming out of it because it's force and power together, not just the quick movement. Because somebody could just move quickly but not have any power behind it. So those flashy drills online, oftentimes they can be just very confusing in general. I like to tell my fighters all the time, just don't get caught up in the flashy exercises. Just understand like where you are right now. Right now, you might be trying to just build up your strength base so that way you can express power. And then also know when you're going over your technique, when you're hitting the bag, you can be developing that power as well. So if we're building a strong base and then you're using that as a translation over into your sport from hitting the bag or really doing power shots on the bag, you are developing power in that instance as well. So you don't need to add extra things such as med ball throws in because you are doing essentially a med ball throw if you're really trying to throw a hard power shot as much as you can. Um, so just understand it doesn't take you doing extra drills. That's just another tool that we can use to train that movement pattern without over fatiguing the muscles that you're using on a day-to-day basis in your sport. So understand you can develop power without those things, but these are just tools that we use to help kind of offset some of the overuse that can happen when you're doing your sport specific skill work. So, getting into some of the ways that I go about developing power in my athletes and my fighters that I train, we start with strength. So, in the main movement patterns, we go with hinge, which is a bending motion, a squat, push, pull, and single leg movements such as lunge patterns. So, we do all those things, trying to build strength in those patterns. So that way, once you have a good amount of force that you've developed in those patterns, now you can try to start to move quickly in those things. So, how do we know when we're moving out of that phase? So, let's just say we've been doing RDLs for about, let's just say 4 weeks, and it's been at 8 reps. And every single week, we've been able to add 10 reps to our top set, or not 10 reps, but 10 pounds or 15 pounds to our top set each and every week. Then we know we're still in the early stages of development because we're actually able to increase the weight relatively at a high level or pretty quickly over an extended period of time. When you've reached a certain experience level in resistance training, gains won't come that easily. You'll have to do a longer training cycle. You'll have to do more variations more often than not in order to gain that strength. So the same thing, if we were doing a squat variation, let's say a Zercher squat, and from week to week, you got 10 pounds more on each lift, then the next cycle and you were doing Zercher squats again, and you were still able to add 10 pounds, 10 pounds, 10 pounds, then we know that you're still at a beginner stage and you're able to make gains. And most of that is just based on learning the movement pattern. So again, there is an importance to doing your strength and conditioning work, your resistance training, and doing it for an extended period of time to get used to using your body in those specific patterns and your body learning how to control load in those patterns, your body learning how to express force out of those specific patterns, and express eventually power out of those specific patterns. So it has to learn how to control, it has to learn how to stabilize through those patterns, and you get that from your resistance training. If you kind of skip over that, then you kind of make compensations. I've seen this in quite a few fighters I've trained. They make compensations in certain movement patterns that they'll do inside of their sport in order to work around the strength deficits or the control that they could have in those specific movement patterns. So you want to make sure that you shore up that area so you have more tools available to you in your sport. So it's just giving you more tools to work with, building up more so your athletic base in order to allow you to really reach and express your full potential in there. So the next thing, we layer in power once strength is there. So once the strength is there, now I still keep some power development inside of the program so that way, they do learn the movements that will allow them to develop power, but we aren't doing those movements as a sole focus to develop power because they still have a ways to go. They may have ways to go in order to build that strength. There are some fighters who have an extensive amount of experience doing resistance training, and they don't necessarily need that base anymore because they already have the base. So we'll put more emphasis on that. And I've made the mistake in the past of trying to do more power development work beforehand on people who actually just needed a stronger base of strength, and they're going to be able to develop or express more power just by that. And there are some people, there is a genetic component to it, but we're not talking about that in this one. We're talking about how to raise your ability to develop power and the difference between strength and power. Kind of getting off here, but getting back to it. So once the strength is there, we can do things like trap bar jumps and really get a good effect out of it. We can do med ball throws and get a good effect out of it. Box jumps and get a good effect out of it. Because if I see somebody doing a box jump and they're landing really deep in the squat, and regardless of how high they try to jump, they're still landing so deep in the squat, or if they can't even get their hips open, then I know we need to really develop that movement pattern more so they can understand how to stand up, open your hips when you're developing or expressing power to land as high as possible. But that comes from the force that you place into the ground and launch yourself up onto the box. When it comes to the med ball throws, being able to rotate all the way through under control and then resist that lean over into that leg that's closest to the wall you're throwing the ball into, and that comes from the stability on that leg. In order to express that, if you can't resist that position in your lower body, then it ends up being a movement to where your body might slow it down in order for you to not fall over. So you're really not getting the full expression of that power. The other aspect of it is training your body to know when to contract and relax, because a lot of it is more neural than anything else. So your nervous system really controls a lot of this. So being able to know when, okay, we need to develop power in that rotation, throwing the ball into the wall, and then we need to let these muscles relax in order to fully get that expression, and we need to let these muscles activate. So, and that takes time. Then also the balance in the movement, where your feet are, the trap bar jumps, how strong are you and stable are you jumping off of the ground with that weight and then absorbing that weight in the landing. Have you done a ton of repetitions with heavy loads because you're adding more load as you land with that bar? So it's very important to develop that base level of strength in order to actually layer in these things. So at the beginning of our sessions, typically we'll do some of these movements, but for the majority of the fighters that are at that still strength base building phase, we'll do more box jumps than anything else. Because they're typically more on the safe side as far as reduction in like just knee irritation or anything like that. And the impact is a lot lower on the lower extremity when you land on top of the box. And it's kind of teaching how to open up the hips a little bit more. And then, we'll go into following that, the strength building stuff. So all of the really strong weighted ballistic movements might be later on down the line for people who need to develop that strength base, or they might already get that if they've already had experience with the strength base. So the next thing is training power with purpose. So low volume. So when we do train power, the volume is low. So what it will look like in a training session, essentially at the beginning, might be 2 sets or 2 to 3 repetitions of a trap bar jump or a barbell back squat jump. And this isn't like 300 pounds on somebody's back. This is more so like a very light weight that you can get off the ground and move quickly with. Again, it's how quickly you develop force. So the volume is low, and it's not 12 sets or anything like that. It's It may be 5, it may be 4, it may be 3. 5 is a little bit on the extensive end, but the most I usually would give my fighters would be 3 to 4 sets of that type of work. Again, because everything else that they're doing, a lot of stuff does develop the power. Um, and another kind of big concept that I like to emphasize is that the lower body is where that power is starting from. Like it's coming up the chain, and that rotation, that torque is what goes into everything else and allows for the powerful strikes to come, for the quick uh, takedowns. So the power in your takedowns. So the biggest thing is developing the lower body. Like that's one of my emphasis is the lower body and then also the hips because it's not necessarily coming from the knee extension so much um as it's coming from strong posterior chain, hip extension, a lot more. You do have the combination of knee extension and hip extension, and then also ankle extension, depending on what you are doing. But the majority of it is like strong hips. Plus, a lot of fighters are in that kind of like position to where they're front end dominant. So the posterior chain, the back end, the hips can be a little bit underdeveloped. So it's really important if you ever want to reach your potential with power development to develop your posterior chain. That's just something I've seen in the fighters that I've trained and I'm training currently is that developing their posterior chain, developing the bending movement pattern. So RDLs, dumbbell RDLs, single leg RDLs, hip thrusts. Really overemphasizing those has allowed them to really get a good amount of power development, or express more power without doing an extensive amount of the other stuff, the med ball throws and trap bar jumps and stuff like that. And once again, it's just a small part of their training at the beginning, but the main part is a lot of the strength work. And they've been able to go into their training sessions and be like, yeah, no, like I feel way more powerful, way more fluid, faster, by just doing that work. But again, it's that work on top of them doing their skill, getting really proficient at their skill, and then trying to throw that kick with a lot more power, trying to throw that punch with way more power. So the volume stays low so that way the intent is high with their power development. Because if the intent isn't high and you're fatigued, you're really not actually developing power. The next thing is full recovery between sets. We already talked about this before. 3 minutes is typically the golden rule for me at the least. And then no junk reps. So not just doing it if you're fatigued and you're wiped out. Because if you come to the session and you're already heavily fatigued, you're not going to really get much out of it. You may be able to kind of dial in some technique things, but you're not really going to develop power when you're under fatigue. So if a fighter is stressed, injured, or still learning movement, we don't force power. We stay focused on the base. We try and reinforce strength, stability, and they kind of go hand in hand in some cases, but we really try and reinforce that base if all of those other factors aren't there because we aren't developing power if we're heavily stressed out and our system can't put out at 100%. So, like I said before, the majority of my fighters I train get a small dose of power development, and the rest is building their strength base. So, how do I know that we're developing power? Is through measures such as like how high they're jumping onto the box, how quick they're actually moving, how high they're landing on top of the box when they're doing box jumps, how quickly they're moving the barbell. A couple of my guys that I have doing like a pause bench press, if I see them moving the bar off of their chest really quickly, if you heard a jerk in my voice, it's because I was like trying to move the my hands really quickly. But I would see like they would pause and then how quickly they can get the weight off of their chest. And that was something that it was Fred Duncan. He was pretty much explaining in one of his videos that, you know, we kind of lose with all of the technology, the coach's eye to see like if someone is actually making improvements in an area that we want them to make improvements on. So in this instance, we're talking about power development. So being there, coaching the athlete in real time and watching him do the bench press, like the pause block bench press, and seeing him actually move the weight off of his chest faster than he did 3 weeks prior at a heavier load, I was just like, okay, we are definitely developing power and you are getting more powerful because you're moving this weight quickly, a lot quicker than you did before. So, once again, like we said, power is force moved quickly or force developed quickly. I'm messing this up. Look, I am not like a heavy science, is the ability to produce force quickly. I'm not a heavy science guy. But I do know like the science behind it. But I try and keep things just like as simple as possible when it comes to talking about these concepts. So, and almost too simple for myself sometimes to where I forget the science terminology that we use. But yeah, so being able to see that in real time and how quickly the bar moves off the chest or how quickly you get off of the ground. If you're doing a depth jump, if you jump off of the box and then you land onto the ground, how quickly you move off the ground from there, and kind of seeing that from week to week or even just in that same session. Um, and then also the knockouts that they get in their fights. If I have a lot of fighters getting knockouts in their fights, and I know that, hey, we actually might be developing power over here, which over the course of, the past year or so, we've had quite a few knockouts. So yeah, it comes from those different measures. We'll put it that way. So you can't express what you haven't built. I learned that lesson the hard way myself, trying to be fast before I was strong, and it backfired every single time. I started off with Olympic lifting. Well, no, I started off with CrossFit. Then I went into Olympic lifting, and I really wasn't that strong yet, at least from my viewpoint. And I wondered why it was so challenging for me to do certain movements and lift certain weight. But then once I started to really focus in on, all right, I'm gonna do this strength cycle and really focus on getting strong in the positions that I need to be in. And I'll just put it this way: the baseline of me doing, let's just say, a hang power clean at 185 became easy for me. Before it was a struggle to even get that weight, but then it became easy for me to just cycle through repetitions during a training block. And I was like, okay, now my baseline has improved, because you also have to remember that with some of those lifts, and that's why I don't really give my fighters Olympic lifts too often, is they're pretty complex. You got to learn the movement pattern to really get the most out of them. So we might do a pull instead of the actual full power clean or anything like that. And it's a little bit easier on the body to do pulls as far as the upper extremity joints. So if they lack range of motion for the front rack, it might be easier for just to do a pull instead. So yeah, for me, it just improved my baseline. And then I remember one specific time, and I said this in one of the other podcasts, that the strongest I was, that I ended up getting like, I don't know, 20 some odd pounds on my split jerk just by doing the squat, deadlift, bench press, and some overhead strength work for 12 weeks, and barely doing heavy split jerks. And my split jerk went up almost 30 pounds. It was crazy to me. And that just came from developing that power or developing the strength or the force to be able to develop that power quickly through my lower extremity all the way up, transferring into the barbell and it being pushed off of the shoulders. So that was one thing that was very enlightening to me. So that's why I really heavily emphasize a lot of leg strength when it comes to my fighters' workouts. So I want to leave you with this. Ask yourself this question: do I have the strength to express power? And the next question would be, am I resting enough between sets to actually be explosive? I can't stand seeing people trying to go through like these quick sessions to where they're doing one movement to the next movement to the next movement, and they're barely resting, but they're saying they're developing power, which people would more so call that power endurance if they're doing stuff like that. But really, I just call it fatigue work, because we need to keep the main thing the main thing. If you're trying to develop like absolute power to knock somebody out, then you need to be developing power under no fatigue. So I'll leave you with those questions. Ask yourself those things. And remember, power doesn't come from hustle. It comes from your preparation. So how you actually prepare to be powerful in your sessions. Are you taking enough rest between sets? Are you strong enough to express power? Are you doing things that are too complicated that don't allow you to fully express power in your training sessions. So, as always, I appreciate you for listening. If you got some benefit from it and you feel like someone else can benefit, share it. Send it out to some of your coaches' friends or some of your other training partners. Send it out, spread the word, get the message out there. And we're trying to, make sure we change the culture from, just go, go, go being so hard and ignoring like the science behind some of these. We don't have to get too crazy with the science, but ignoring like sound principles just because we want to appear tough. Remember, toughness isn't just about like pushing through pain or anything like that, but toughness comes from actually speaking up and knowing exactly what you need to develop the skills that you are trying to develop and get to where you need to get to. All right. I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you in the next one.